Hello everyone. In this video, I'd like to teach you how to take all that great research you have for your controversial topic and develop an outline for a persuasive argument, a debate argument, for and against that issue, that resolution. This will take a little bit of time, so go ahead and grab a cup of coffee, get some notes, and prepare to dig in. We'll start with looking at what a resolution is. Your resolution is the one sentence that you're debating. It's that sentence such as, abortion should remain legal, or animal testing should be banned, or public school students in the United States should wear uniforms. And I'll be using this final statement as an example in this presentation. The resolution is typically something controversial, typically something that represents a change to the status quo, but not always. And it's something that will get people to argue for and against it. People who agree with the resolution are on the affirmative side. So if the resolution is public school students in the United States should wear uniforms, the affirmative is exactly the same. The affirmative agrees with this resolution, agrees with the statement as is. Whereas the negative will take the same resolution, public school students in the United States should be required to wear uniforms, and turn it into the negative or opposite opinion. People on the negative side disagree with the statement as is. So when you write your negative side, you will say, public school students in the United States should not be required to wear uniforms. Then we look at contentions. These are the reasons why or the reasons why not. So you're going to develop your contentions for each side. Public school students should, public school students should not, simply by adding because to your resolution and finishing the sentence. So if I am arguing the affirmative resolution, public school students in the United States should be required to wear uniforms, I add this word because and see what comes up. Those will be my reasons. I might say because they, students, will take school more seriously and achieve more. That might be one contention. Or it will decrease bullying. Contention number 2, another reason why we should have uniforms. Or contention number 3, it costs less than individual clothing. Now you might want to think about the order in which you present these, which will carry the greatest weight for your viewer. Typically you want the one that is the strongest argument toward the end, but you can use this because structure simply to brainstorm what arguments you might want to use in the first place. You'll do the same thing for your negative side, the why not. So simply add because to that negative statement that you've developed. Public school students in the United States should not be required to wear uniforms because, and then you think of all the reasons why they should not have to have uniforms. So that might be, it's a financial burden on families, your contention or your reason number 1. It stifles the individuality necessary for creativity. That might be your contention or reason number 2. Or it disregards students' emotional and physical comfort, which then limits their achievement. And that would be controversial statement number 3 or contention number 3. So you'll again want to think about the order of the contentions that you've developed, but develop your contentions or your reasons simply by adding because to your resolution. Once you have your reasons or your contentions, you need to prove it with solid evidence. And that can come in many different forms, which we'll look at with a few examples. I'm going to just preface this by saying I used a little bit of creative license here. None of the facts or quotes are actually from research. They do not exist. I made them up. But I made them up for the purpose of showing you the types of evidence you'll use, and I wrote them in the way that typically research would present this information. So some examples of evidence for school uniforms. I might use statistics. These are for the number crunchers among you. Something like this. Once uniforms were adopted in Anytown, North Carolina, scores on standardized tests went up 63% number for 3 consecutive years in math and went up 39% in reading for 4 years. These are statistics, numbers that convince certain people in your audience. Another example of a statistic, 7 of every 10 students in grades 8 through 10 preferred uniforms once they were adopted. Here's another example of evidence for school uniforms. You can look at studies, and you'll see all kinds of studies on these controversial topics. So you might have something like, In one study of 8th grade girls, those who wore uniforms to school were more likely to report a lower self-esteem. Ooh, bad, not a good thing. Or, as researchers found in 12 U.S. school districts, parents of students on free and reduced lunch claimed that the uniforms were costly almost 3 times as often as those not on free and reduced lunch. So again, a study that would cite something. Another type of evidence you might use is expert testimonial or quotations. And this word expert here is really quite important, because if it's not an expert saying what it is that you're quoting, probably you've got the fallacy of false authority. So make sure that it's someone that's related to it. But it might be a topic like this uniforms, and we're talking about how the uniforms affect students psychologically. So in that case, it would be appropriate to pull in psychologist Aaron Berkland, who claims uniforms give students a sense of belonging to a larger group, a sense of belonging that is strongly correlated with achievement. Or Celeste Norman said it best. We're going to assume that Celeste Norman has some bearing on this topic. American students excel in tasks that involve risk-taking, independence, and divergent thinking, all skills required in expressing one's individual style. Again, testimonial or quotations that can persuade people simply because the speaker of the quotation either has credentials or says something in a particularly effective way. Another type of evidence you might use is examples and anecdotes. Stories, basically. Here's an example of what happens when you legalize marijuana. Here's an example of what happens when abortion is restricted. That type of thing. So for the topic of school uniforms, I have Marie Stenner was a slightly overweight sophomore at Northeast High School when the district decided that students should wear uniforms. She had previously had perfect attendance for almost 2 years. However, the district uniforms were very unflattering for her, and she quickly became very self-conscious about going to school. She missed 43 classes during her first semester and failed several classes. So this one example is something I might use to show that students who are forced to wear uniforms that don't look good on them are going to feel uncomfortable, and when they're not comfortable, they're not going to do well in school. But oftentimes one example or one anecdote can make a point. Now you can run into the fallacy with this examples and anecdotes of the limited sample size. That you can say, well, just because your uncle knew how to handle a gun doesn't mean that everybody knows how to handle a gun. So be careful about which examples and anecdotes you use, and be sure to clarify that they are just one example, and you can back them up with further research that shows the bigger picture. Let's take a look at an additional type of evidence, and that would be the analogy or the comparison. And this is basically making a metaphor or a simile for the point you want to make. So something like this. Wearing uniforms to increase school achievement is like spraying fruits and vegetables with pesticides to help consumers lose weight. The relationship simply isn't there. And that would be comparing, in this case, uniforms for achievement with vegetables and sprays for dieting. And through the analogy, you can often make some sense. So one thing you want to take into account is to choose evidence that supports your contention. So let's just say I'm arguing the affirmative side that uniforms should increase achievement. Here's one piece of evidence. Once uniforms were adopted, these scores went up by these percentages. Or David Brenner raised his SAT scores by 150 points after he began wearing a uniform. Or 7 of every 10 students in grades 8 through 10 preferred uniforms once they were adopted. Now, it should be obvious to you that this last piece of evidence doesn't really relate to achievement, so I'm not going to choose that particular piece of evidence for this particular contention. I might want to use one of these two, though, since we're talking about achievement. And this is where the art really comes in. You think about what will be most convincing to your audience. Would it be most convincing to have standardized test scores for the group increase, or would one particular example have that pathos, that emotional appeal that would reach some of your audience? So give thought to both logos, pathos, and ethos, or all of logos, pathos, and ethos as you choose your evidence, and be sure that it applies. Here's some other examples on that. Let's say I have the negative contention for my argument, my research, my resolution, and my negative contention is that uniforms are a financial burden. So I've got a cost analysis of what each uniform costs with a grand total of $306.53. Again, I made these statistics up. I've got a statement here on what private counselors charge for sessions to help poor students who have been bullied without these uniforms. And most low SES families, socioeconomic status families, are able to obtain clothing from friends and relatives, so they don't actually spend as much as the clothing budget's estimates would suggest. So if I'm going to argue that the uniforms are a financial burden, I might not consider the one that had numbers in it and costs, because I want to show uniforms are not a good idea. And this piece of evidence here is saying they were bullied prior to that implementation and it costs them money. So I'm going to X out this piece of information. I might want to look at this number, but this number alone might not be sufficient for convincing my audience that this was an unnecessary expense. And I might want to just simply pull out the logic here that families that are low SES aren't actually going to be spending this much money anyway, because they would go to friends and relatives for their clothing. Well, that wouldn't necessarily show the financial burden. This is one that the other side might use to refute that. Just remember that evidence alone isn't enough. You've got to be able to explain why or how your contention proves what you're trying to prove. So, for example, if I simply state, in one study of 8th grade girls, those who wore uniforms to school were more likely to report a lower self-esteem, my reader or my listener might not connect the dots. So it's my job to do the dot to dot and come up with an explanation like this. Why does this matter? Because students who do not feel good about themselves cannot do well academically. The uniforms were the contributing factor to the girls' self-esteem problems, and this cannot lead to high achievement. Thus, it's ridiculous to think that, as the affirmative side claims, simply having young people don new apparel will increase achievement. Furthermore, as you're developing your arguments for and against your resolution, you're choosing your contentions for and against that resolution, remember to respond to your opponent and plan for this. So if your opponent is looking at your arguments, your opponent might say something about the argument that uniforms help students to take school seriously. What would he say about that? Ask yourself. Or what would your opponent say about the research that you used? Maybe your opponent would say, that's old research, that's from 25 years ago. Maybe your opponent would say that research is such a small sample size, it's not really going to be valid. But think about what the most ardent opponent of your position, whichever one you're writing, would say about your arguments and your research. Think again, what would your opponent say to the arguments that uniforms stifle individuality? What's someone going to say against that? Anticipate it and refute it. What is that opponent going to say about the particular experts that you quoted? It might be that your opponent would say, hey, this is the fallacy of false authority, and challenge your research. So again, always be thinking, what is the opponent going to say about my research and my arguments? Finally, as you're developing your contentions and your arguments, watch out for logical fallacies. And I'll take a moment to let you read my favorite Calvin and Hobbes strip. Gotta love Calvin and Hobbes. So these are some frequently observed logical fallacies that we looked at in our previous session. Ad hominem, attack the person instead of what the person is saying. Slippery slope, it's all going downhill from here. We can't stop it. Either or, we have only two choices and there's not a third option. False cause was suggesting that something that happened before something else was the cause of something else. This is the same thing with the statement, correlation does not equal causation, which you may have heard. Appeal to false authority. This is the idea that your expert is not really an expert in the field. If you're talking to a dentist, you're not likely to get credible information about outer space exploration. And the idea of bandwagon. Just because people say it's a good idea doesn't mean that it is a good idea. If your parents ever told you just because everyone else jumps off a bridge doesn't mean you should jump off a bridge. Same idea. So here's some examples on how that plays out with content. With ad hominem, you might have a statement like this. The Republicans conceived of this idea, so clearly these Medicaid reforms are unnecessary. That's just blaming the Republicans and not looking at whether those reforms are actually necessary. Slippery slope. Well, if we have a single-payer healthcare system run by the government, pretty soon the government will euthanize all 80-year-olds, saying one step will necessarily lead to this terrible step, so we better not have a single-payer healthcare system. Here are a couple more examples. Either or. If we don't build a wall by the Mexican border, illegal immigrants will steal all these good jobs. Well, it's suggesting there's no other alternative but building the wall, no other way to deal with the influx of immigrant labor, and that's the fallacy. False cause. Crime has gone down in Colorado since recreational marijuana was legalized. Well, it could be that crime has gone down for another reason, like maybe there were more police out enforcing laws, or maybe crime went down because the economy was good. Just because marijuana was legalized and then crime went down doesn't mean that marijuana's legalization caused the crime to go down. Two more. Appeal to false authority. Well, my uncle runs a business in a rural town and he says gun control will never work. Well, the skills for running a business are different than knowledge of gun control and law enforcement. He's a false authority. He's not really an expert in that area. Bandwagon is my last example. 74% of people who want to fund a U.S.-led mission to Mars by 2025, so clearly we should do this. This is how we should allocate our resources because people want it. Well, there may be some validity to that in a democratic society, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the mission is achievable, attainable, realistic. And yes, I made this one up too. So you put all this together. This is what you're going to come up with for your debate outline. And you are welcome to create an outline just like this, or you can create a graphic or other table that is provided in the session. But here's basically the order of information and the types of information you're going to need. You'll start with some kind of attention-getting quotation, statistic, or anecdote, and then transition by saying, because I agree with the person, or I agree with this statistic, because I agree with this cause. Then I will state my resolution. Uniforms should be worn by all students in America. I'm going to give my first reason. I will make a sentence that includes because and then the reason. I will give 3 pieces of evidence, 2 to 3 pieces of evidence per resolution. I will give quotations from my research, or I will paraphrase in my own words what that research is saying. I'll give an explanation for how it proves my reason, and then I'll have a transition to my next piece of evidence, such as not only this, but also, or in addition, or similarly, or in a similar manner, in a broader sense, any type of transition. And then another piece of evidence, direct quotation or paraphrase, explanation, transition, give a third piece of evidence and explain that. Then toward the end of this discussion of this reason, I will say, well, what would my opponent say? And answer that question. Opponents would say that school uniforms cause blah, 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 blah. And then I would say, but the problem with this is that the research that leads them to conclude this is 25,000 years old, or something along those lines. So deal with my opponents there, then clearly restate my resolution and my reason or contention at the end of that section. Then I move on and I do the same thing with my second reason and all the research there, and so forth. So that's basically where you're going. I want you to give this a try in our next activity, which is to come up with your own outline. Please don't be afraid to ask for help. Let me know how I can.